Our speaker this morning is the esteemed Hal Miller-Jacobs, whose reputation precedes him. Hal and his wife Sandy and their family are among the first people I met when I came to Amuna a long time ago. My birthday is coming up this week, so I'm thinking kind of in historical terms like that. Hal is a true mensch. Hal is one of the founders of the community Hevra Kadisha of Greater Boston, which I'm honored to be affiliated with him. And he is a longtime member, along with his family, of Temple Amuna. So it's an honor to have him speak this morning. Hal, b'vakasha, b'kavod.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. So this week's Parsha is Parshat Vayera, in which we recount the 7 plagues that befell Egypt. Plagues? Well, we always try to make the Torah portion relate to what we have in the real world today. I mean, could we be any closer than that? It's just amazing that it's Parshat Vayera. However, this morning I'd like to speak about another plague that we have, and that is a plague in many places of the world to try and delegitimize Israel. For example, at the UN, the Human Rights Commission condemned Israel 14 times in 2021. The rest of the world combined was condemned 5 times. The BDS, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions Movement, has gained strength. Ben & Jerry's, a company I'm familiar with, will no longer sell in the West Bank because of their complying with BDS. And the anti-Israel forces are looking for allies wherever they can find them. And they actually have found some allies in of all places, the LGBTQ community. A new plague has come upon us. This is the plague of pink washing. Just a show of hands, how many people have ever heard of pink washing? It looks like about 2 or 3 people have heard of pink washing. What is pink washing? Now, we know that Israel has been associated with tolerance and acceptance of LGBTQ plus folks for a long time. Tel Aviv is often billed as the capital of the LGBTQ community in the Mideast, if not in the world. The claim is that Israel is just using the LGBT communities to whitewash their oppression of Palestinians. Since the color pink is often associated with LGBTQ folks, Israel whitewashes its treatment of Palestinians by glorifying their supposed treatment of LGBT community and using the pink color, hence the very catchy phrase, pink washing. Now, whoever on the marketing team came up with that term, terrific. It's a very, very clever marketing technique, pink washing. I teach part-time at Tufts University. I started there as a grad student in 1968 and basically have never left, a couple of years. In my email a few weeks ago, I saw a meeting notice called, a movie was being shown called Pink Washing Exposed. It was presented by a university organization, the LGBTQ Center, the purpose of which is to ensure that LGBTQ students are not discriminated against, and another organization called Students for Justice in Palestine. A few years ago, I came across this Students for Justice in Palestine. I attended one of their meetings. What they did is they brought a petty thief from Israel who was convicted of many times of various minor claims. And he was telling about how he was treated in Israel and how poorly he was treated. He claimed to only speak Hebrew. They had to have an interpreter speak for him. And the purpose was to show how terrible Israel was through the eyes of this individual. I attended that meeting, so I had a sense of what the Students for Justice in Palestine was all about. Well, I went to the meeting on pinkwashing exposed. There were 18 students and myself. I assume they were from the LGBT community, and some were probably from the SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, if not both. The movie was a documentary of what occurred in Seattle when the group Stand with Israel, a very pro-Israel group, and the Israel consulate tried to show what a great life LGBTQ people had in Israel. However, the anti-Israel forces in Seattle tried to limit and even cancel the various events that were had. It was blatantly anti-Israel film. After the meeting, questions were solicited. I waited for the few students to ask questions, and then I asked, how are LGBTQ people treated in various Palestinian communities? A young woman answered, and she said, well, it depends on the community you are, and she went on for quite a while. And then I responded by saying, well, in the Gaza community, it's quite known that you can be sentenced up to 10 years in prison for participating in such activities. And I also mentioned, kind of like a little bit of humor, that we know, for example, it's not as bad as in Iran because Iran has no LGBTQ people. President Ahmadinejad, whatever his name is, said that there are no LGBTQ people in Iran. And I tried to then ask other questions, and the moderator then saw what my position was and politely asked me to leave the meeting. I did not leave the meeting immediately. I went after a while. A few days after that event, I received a notice saying that I was being charged with making Islamophobic statements and was being investigated by the Office of Equal Opportunity at Tufts, who investigated all discrimination charges. The next day, I had a Zoom conversation with an investigator who wanted to hear my side of the story. I asked if I could record the conversation, and she said they do not allow recordings, but she would document the meetings and send me her notes. We spoke for over an hour, and I explained my side of the story and spoke, and she explained what the charges were against me. And then she actually did a fairly good job documenting our conversation, and we had a few emails back and forth. In my final email, I mentioned that the only people who were discriminated against at that meeting were Israelis and Israeli students at Tufts. And that the LGBTQ Center, which is a university organization, not a student organization, had no business being involved in a movie that maligned another group of people. I'm glad to report that a few days later, the Office of Equal Opportunity said they were dropping charges against me. However, they did strongly suggest that I be very careful in attending student meetings and be very careful of what I said at those meetings. Now, I asked myself, why did I go to that meeting? What was my motivation in going for that meeting? Yeah, I wanted to make sure that Israel wasn't maligned and possibly even maybe convince some of the students in there about how positive it was to support Israel. I doubt if I swayed even one student. And basically, in that goal, I failed miserably, I'm sure. Getting back to the Parsha. In his book, Lessons in Leadership, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks notes that Parshat Vayera describes how Moshe fails many times. He does not get Paro to agree to let the Israelites go. He concludes his section by saying that the road to success passes through many failures, valleys of failures. And Moshe had to pass through some valleys of failures before he was able to get Paro to let the Israelites go. Maybe that's a slight consolation for me, failure. What are we doing to confront our current COVID plague? We're getting vaccinated and boosted, wearing masks, social distancing, and having virtual minyanim on go. Question is what we are doing to confront the plague of anti-Israel rhetoric, especially on our woke college campuses. I don't think we're doing enough. We must educate our students on how to react to this type of hatred when confronted. Last week, CAMERA, an organization that many of you I'm sure know about, presented a session on how to defend against anti-Israel rhetoric. Just to give you one of the techniques that were mentioned, the speaker, one technique is to always ask the speaker, what do you mean by that? For example, if the speaker says, well, Israel is a colonial power, always ask, well, what do you mean by that? Always put the onus on the other person to explain rather than you explain initially. So in spite of the warnings received from the Tufts Office of Equal Opportunity, I will continue to attend meetings and continue to speak up for Israel. I hope our children, our grandchildren will learn how to respond so they too can and will do the same thing on their campuses. Shabbat Shalom.